Marcus Aurelius had a dream that was Rome, Proximo. This is not it.
I had the privilege of reading his meditations.
Will I be known as the philosopher, the warrior, the tyrant?
Marcus Aurelius is dead, Maximus. We mortals are but shadows and dust. Shadows and dust, Maximus!
They are iconic films. They've won all the awards you can win: Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Score, Best Sound. They've made hundreds of millions of dollars. They've been seen by millions of people. And they've also introduced millions of people to Stoic philosophy, including indirectly myself. Like when someone first recommended Marcus Aurelius' Meditations to me, I was like, oh, that's that old guy from the movie Gladiator that Joaquin Phoenix's character kills. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Stoic lessons from Gladiator 1 and 2, and the real life Stoic teachings that they're connected to from Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, Epictetus, and Seneca. Let's get into it. So obviously Gladiator is a work of fiction, but it's based on some stuff that is real. Marcus Aurelius, of course, exists. He does have a son named Commodus. The arc of Maximus, the general who wants to return to his farm, that's based on the myth of Cincinnatus. But the dichotomy between a great man, Marcus Aurelius, and a screwed up son, Commodus, that's Richard Harris and Joaquin Phoenix, who plays Commodus, that is also very real. Marcus Aurelius does have a terrible son. The scene in the movie is Marcus calls Maximus to his tent. Marcus says, I want you to be Rome's protector. And Maximus says, but what about Commodus? And Marcus says, look, this is the problem, that Commodus is not a moral man. He can see that his son is not well. Now, in real life, Marcus almost certainly didn't intend for Commodus to take over right away. In fact, there's just an unending series of tragedies that put this into motion. Marcus Aurelius buries 11 children. Commodus is in some ways the last man standing, like literally the last son standing. And there's some belief that Marcus wanted him to rule the way he had ruled with a co-emperor. Marcus ruled with his stepbrother Lucius Verus. Marcus had tried multiple times in real life to try to shield Commodus from himself. But in the end, he didn't have the courage to do what fictional Marcus had the courage to at least try to do. But it does make you think, how could such an incredible man have such an awful son? And unfortunately, this is more the rule than the exception in history. Churchill has a flawed and tragic son. FDR, his 4 children have like 12 or 15 marriages. Even Cyrus the great Eastern king, does not have a great son. Why in real life does Marcus Aurelius pass power on to Commodus? Marcus's 4 predecessors had chosen their successor. And Marcus, having a male son, perhaps felt like he didn't have that choice. And the result, tragically, was disaster. And it's this tension, the impossible choice that Marcus Aurelius faced, that they try to capture at the beginning of the movie. So after Marcus talks to Maximus, he calls his son Commodus in. And they have an interesting discussion that brings up, I think, an important Stoic theme. Commodus says, Dad, you wrote to me once talking about the 4 virtues: courage, discipline, justice, and wisdom. But with a remarkable amount of self-awareness, Commodus admits that he does not have these virtues.
But none of my virtues won your list. Even then, it was as if you didn't want me for your son.
And again, we can imagine what it must have been like to have a father who was so admired and so impressive, how he must have felt like he could never measure up. And so what Commodus in the movie does is he tries to say, well, I have these other virtues. I have these other things. He's saying, Dad, can you be proud of me for these things? He says, ambition.
That can be a virtue when it drives us to excel.
But it's an interesting point. Is ambition a virtue? What would the Stoics say? What would the real Marcus have said if Commodus had in fact come to him and said, you know, I might not be courageous or self-disciplined or particularly honest or wise, but I am really ambitious. Well, one of my favorite passages in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius writes specifically on ambition. He says, the problem with ambition is that it's about tying our sanity to other people's opinions, to other people's approval. He says, sanity has to be rooted in our own actions. The problem with ambition is that, ambition wants to be emperor. Commodus desperately wants power. And what does that make him do in the movie? It makes him kill his own father. It makes him betray and lie and cheat and do awful, horrible things. Marcus Aurelius didn't, in real life and in the movie, doesn't have this kind of ambition. Marcus Aurelius is into self-actualization, not achievement. He's into doing good as opposed to being seen as good. And throughout Meditations, Marcus Aurelius returns to this theme of ambition. In fact, in book 7 of Meditation, he says to really think about ambitious people, to put yourself in your mind and see the screwed up things that they prize. He would have known people like Joaquin Phoenix portrays in the movie. Marcus Aurelius in real life would have known people like that. In book 8, Marcus Aurelius talks about conquering his ambition, getting over it, realizing that it doesn't matter. So in a way, Gladiator does a really good job of showing us that this thing that Commodus thinks is a virtue is in fact a fatal flaw. Wanting something outside of our control, wanting something beyond our capacities. In this case, Commodus wants to be emperor, but he is woefully unqualified and ill-suited for this job. But he wants it, and he thinks it says something about him to get it or to not get it. And this is what drives him to commit the most heinous sin you could commit. He kills his own father. He kills the great man, because that great man, in the movie at least, has the sense that he isn't qualified. And perhaps it was, in real life, Marcus Aurelius' own desire for legacy, for wanting to be seen or perceived a certain way that prevented him from doing what he actually needed to do, which is get his son as far away from the seat of power as possible. There's a man walking through a field. The stalks of grain are bending low under their weight. The wind is blowing softly on what seems like a cold day. He sees a small bird land on a branch. Then the bird takes flight and he follows it with his eyes, smiling at the beauty of what the Stoics would call nature's inadvertence. And then the man turns and you see that actually this isn't such a beautiful and pretty scene, that he's surrounded not just by mud, but by all the signs of war. Cavalry is getting ready. Men are marching behind sharp palisades, checking their shields and their swords. They're about to do terrible damage to each other. There will be ceaseless, ferocious violence and death. This is, as you know, the opening scene of the movie Gladiator. Russell Crowe is preparing for a fictionalized version of the macromanic wars, the wars that Marcus Aurelius does in fact wage on the far-flung borders of the Roman Empire. Actually, this is Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe, and they've talked about this scene before. This is kind of an unscripted, improvised moment between the director and the actor in the earliest days of shooting, when they realize that they have this incredible connection and they're going to do something magical together.
I'm pretty sure I did every single thing he asked, and I put little strokes of color on certain things, and then I brought the attention back to the battlefield, and he just came up to me and goes, "You and me are going to be fucking great together, mate."
But it's also, through Maximus, an embodiment of a really key but easy to miss Stoic lesson. In the midst of darkness and death, and the worst things that human beings can do to each other, humans also have the ability to see light and beauty and feel wonder and majesty. Epictetus would say that every situation has two handles. We choose which one we're going to grab. We also get to choose the angle, not unlike a director, that we look at a specific scene at, right? Maximus's gaze, how he's thinking, how he's looking, by framing it one way, he sees all the good, and then he zooms out slightly and he's able to see all the not so good, which is an exercise that we humans can do. Whatever is happening in the world, whether it's the middle of a pandemic or political polarization or your own impending divorce or bankruptcy or health crisis, you choose how you're going to look at this. The Stoics say that our life is dyed by the color of our thoughts. How we choose to look, the perception, the lens with which we look at the world shapes how we're going to see it and how we're going to feel as a result of it. The perspective that we take on life is everything. It's the most important thing. And we miss this power all the time, just as many of you have probably seen this scene in Gladiator and not noticed the subtext of what's happening, the Stoic message that's underneath it. We have to really look. We have to hone our senses. And Marcus Aurelius's life is the quintessential example of this. Again, this is a life with a plague. This is a life where he buried multiple children, where he was betrayed, where there were natural disasters. There was one thing after another. And yet what you find in meditations, is there a certain amount of world weariness? Is this a certain amount of darkness? Is there a certain amount of depressiveness? Yeah, sure. And people have noted that for a long time. But you also can't read Meditations and not see Marcus Aurelius's zest for life, his poet's eye, his gratitude, his perception about how lucky he is, about how wonderful life can be. And this is the power that we all have, an edge that the Stoic is trying to hone always. We should remember that in almost every way, Marcus Aurelius's times were worse than ours are now, more stressful than ours are now, darker than ours are now. We should choose to see all the positivity and beauty and change and progress and take solace and inspiration in the fact that if he was able to find good and things to be excited about and things to get out of bed for in the morning, then certainly we can too. So one of the coolest scenes in Meditations is Maximus is in the bowels of the Colosseum. He's on one of the ramps, about to run up onto the floor of the Colosseum to fight. He says, Marcus Aurelius had a dream that was Rome, Proximo, and this is not it. This is not it. And Proximo has to remind him that Marcus Aurelius is dead. He says, we mortals are but shadows and dust. Shadows and dust, Maximus, as he runs out onto the Colosseum. And in fact, Marcus Aurelius writes something like this in Meditations, in real life. He says, soon you'll be ashes or bones. He says, a mere name at most. He says, and even that name is just a sound, an echo. He says, the things we want in life are stale, empty, and trivial. So the Stoics were very aware of the ephemerality, the fleeting nature of existence. Marcus Aurelius, in another passage in Meditation, lists all the emperors that came before him, and he talks about how unfamiliar their names sound now. Where are they? What happened to their accomplishments? How many people even remember them? Alexander the Great and his mule driver, they're both buried in the same thing happened to both. Basically saying they're all worm food. They're all ashes and dust. There are two, I think, key Stoic lessons here. The first is memento mori, life is short, life is fragile, we will be forgotten. And that ties into the second, which is humility. None of us last forever, nothing we do lasts forever. We are not immortal, we are not gods, we're not that important. We are shadows and dust. From dust we came, from dust we will return. That is the humbling nature of existence, and it's a beautiful reminder that we can't forget. In the final scene of Gladiator, Maximus is mortally wounded, and Commodus, who he's just disarmed, is trying to kill him. And so Commodus shouts, he says, sword, sword. He's shouting to his Praetorian guards, but the soldiers refuse to help him. Now, obviously, this is sort of the penultimate scene of the movie, but there's also a really key Stoic lesson in it. Actually, something that Marcus Aurelius talks about in real life in Meditations. He says in Meditations that it's far better to be a boxer than a fencer, that you want to be able to fight with your hands and not a sword, for precisely this very reason, right? He says a fencer has to pick up their weapon. The Praetorian guards have to give you your sword to be able to fight with it. But he says a boxer clenches their fists and then they are armed. The metaphor here is, if you are dependent on external things, if you need approval, if you need access, if you need funding, if you need stuff from other people, you are as vulnerable as Commodus. If you are self-sufficient, if you have what you need, if you are trained to fight even without weapons, you're good even in the worst of situations. And yeah, this is a fictional scene. It's a moving one, to be sure, but it's also an illustration of that idea in Meditations. To be a boxer and not a fencer. You want your weapon to be a part of you rather than an external you're dependent on. And think about this, right? Commodus is dependent on the sword. He's dependent on his Praetorian guards. He's dependent on the power of his office. He's dependent on fear. He's dependent on momentum. Strong men often appear very strong, but in fact, they're incredibly vulnerable. They're at the mercy of someone or something else. But Maximus is his own man. There's nothing you can take from him because he's already lost everything. But he's also empowered. He moves under his own power. He would have, as a Stoic say, command of the greatest empire, not the throne, but himself. He's ruled by dignity. He's ruled by strength, by his own principles, by his own weapons. by his own mastery. He doesn't need anyone or anything to be great. And even when he is bleeding out, when he has been cheated, when he is encircled, he is still stronger. He is still the better man. All he has to do, as Marcus Aurelius says, is clench his fist. All he has to do is do what he does. And I think that's an interesting question. Like, what are you? Are you Commodus or Maximus? Are you self-reliant or an imposter? Are you dependent or are you independent? Are you a tyrant or a gladiator? A boxer or a fencer? Sometimes people ask me about the movie Gladiator, and I tell them, if anything, Joaquin Phoenix underplays how horrendous Commodus actually was. He was bloodthirsty. We don't know if he was incestuous, but you know what he was? He was obsessed with fame and attention. He slaughters thousands of animals in the Colosseum. Gibbon in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire tells us, like, it makes your stomach turn how many animals Commodus kills in real life in the Colosseum. It made the stomachs turn of the spectators in the Colosseum who went to see blood sport. The sheer psychopathy of this man. And as it happens, in real life, Commodus is killed by a gladiator, not in the arena, but outside it. I think that's another interesting thing about this. Where does he get this from? Why is Commodus obsessed with this? We know that Marcus Aurelius, in real life, detests the carnage that happens in the Colosseum. In fact, we're told that's where he may have written chunks of meditations. The emperor was expected to be at the Colosseum, was expected to make an appearance as the sort of head of the ceremony, but Marcus would read philosophy books there. And he may have written parts of meditations while he was there. So is it kind of a son being interested in what his father was not interested in? Is it kind of a rebellion? Is it that he thought his father was weak or, obsessed with books and he, is it like that kind of thing? I don't exactly know, but there's something there. And there's a dark, twisted element in Commodus that Marcus Aurelius doesn't have in real life. And in fact, a bunch of the metaphors in Meditations showed us how little Marcus thought of the gladiatorial games and blood sports. So many of us are like these animals at the games that are torn up and bleeding and dying, but whether they're the gladiators or the beasts, they want to come back and fight the next day. And to Marcus, this is analogous to us being unchanging. Even though life is beating the shit out of us and tearing us up, all we want to do is come back tomorrow. Instead of fixing, instead of changing, instead of accommodating and adjusting, we just go back to get mauled and gored again. And he thought that this was insane. And then a funny thing about Marcus sort of being so different than his son, we only know of a few laws that Marcus Aurelius passes in real life as emperor, but one of them was that he wanted the gladiators to train and to fight with wooden swords so that they wouldn't get hurt. He was squeamish. He didn't like people getting hurt. And so there's some tension there. There's something tragic about that lesson skipping a generation, or that lesson not fully landing. Commodus missed the point. He thought it was manly and cool to be violent, to hurt people, to inflict pain on other people and other things. I mean, we know now that people who inflict pain on animals, it's a sign they're a dangerous person. They'll probably inflict harm on you too. And that's what lends me to believe that perhaps Commodus was just screwed up. Like, it wasn't Marcus Aurelius' fault as a parent so much as it was just a freak of nature. But he was a flawed and tragic man, and the apple did fall very far from the tree there. It's actually funny, a couple of years ago, Russell Crowe, the star of the movie, tweeted in response to an account that sort of says like dates from history. Russell Crowe tweeted, "I'm sure in Marcus Aurelius' dogged stoicism, he looks back on that shit decision with regret." He quotes Marcus Aurelius. He says that Marcus Aurelius remains an inspiration. Nothing is sent to man that he is not fitted to nature to bear. And I think his implication was that Commodus was in fact not fitted for what Marcus had intended him for, and that was the tragic mistake. But apparently, from what I've read, Russell Crowe has a long-time relationship with that quote, and he used it for inspiration when he was shooting the movie. And he said, every piece of shit that was thrown at me on that set, every challenge on that set, he was like, I thought of that quote. Because it's an amazing quote. And the idea is that in our own lives, we're supposed to say, this is what I'm suited for. I'm fitted by nature to bear this. And we can think about Marcus Aurelius' own life as an illustration of this. We have plagues, we have wars, we have his troublesome son, we have his troubled marriage, we have health issues, we have a plague. You know, it's just one thing after another. But he's trying to remind himself that he's got this. He's meant for this. He's made for this. And I just love the idea that the guy playing the protege of Marcus Aurelius in the movie, as Russell Crowe is doing, is reminding himself, hey, I'm made for this. I've got this. My nature has suited me for precisely this kind of adversity and difficulty. And to me, that's the kind of confidence and endurance that Stoicism is designed to equip us with. It's a very badass line if you've seen the Gladiator sequel. But if you know anything about ancient philosophy, it's sort of a strange choice. If you've seen the movie, they're standing on the wall, they're about to be attacked by the Romans as it happens. And Paul Mescal, who's playing the grandson of Marcus Aurelius, says, "Where we are, death is not. Where death is, we are not." And although this might sound like Stoic philosophy, it's not. It's actually from the rival school of philosophy. It comes to us from the Epicureans. Epicurus said this. He was saying that we shouldn't fear death because when we're alive, we are not dead. And when we are dead, we are not alive, and therefore we have nothing to be afraid of. So it is weird to have in the sort of the main cinematic depiction of Stoic philosophy, of all the lines to pick, and the Stoics talked so much about death that they would be forced to pick from Epicurus, but trying to give the filmmakers the benefit of the doubt, here's what I'll think they're doing. I think they are borrowing a different Stoic practice, which we hear about from Seneca, who loved to quote Epicurus. Seneca said that we should read like a spy in the enemy's camp. When his friend Lucilius asked him why he was quoting Epicurus so much, he said, "I'll quote a bad author if the line is good." So the Stoics didn't believe that they had a monopoly on wisdom, and they believed that if someone did have something that was wise and true, we should adopt it into our own lives. So that's what I believe they're doing here, even though Marcus Aurelius said many better things about this practice of memento mori, about why we don't need to fear death. Epicurus said it pretty well too, and that's why his grandson was quoting it. We just have to remember, like, philosophy is not dogma. Authorship is less important than whether something is true and good. Like, what matters is that the idea gets the job done. What matters is if a philosophical truth helps us live better, if it helps us be better, if it helps us when we're about to be invaded, when we're about to be overwhelmed, or when we are trembling before death. And so the wisdom of Epicurus, of Marcus, of Seneca, of modern filmmakers who are just trying to entertain but happen to chance upon some core philosophical idea, it doesn't matter where it comes from. What matters is that it gets the job done for you. Because that's the purpose of philosophy, to prepare us for something like death, to prepare us for adversity, for loss, for heartbreak, for difficulty. And ultimately, we don't need to be loyal or allegiant to a particular school. We need to be committed to growth, to resilience, and truth wherever it's found. For a lot of dudes, especially dudes my age, Gladiator is one of the great movies of all time. It's your classic dude action film. But actually one of the great characters in it is a woman, and we don't give enough credit or talk enough about Stoic women. But of course there were Stoic women in the ancient world. Stoicism was taught to young women. The Stoics believed that virtue didn't know gender. Some of the great Stoic heroes were women, like Portia Cato, the daughter of Cato. And Marcus Aurelius' daughter in the movie, Lucilla, played by Connie Nelson, is a real person. We don't know that much about her, but she, I think, illustrates a bunch of great Stoic virtues in the movie. I wish they had put in her mouth the lines of one of Marcus Aurelius' other daughters, who said something super badass. This is his daughter Annia, who after Marcus Aurelius' death and after Commodus' death is executed by a later emperor. It just gets terrible. After Marcus Aurelius, after Commodus, it is just like one bad emperor after another. And so Marcus Aurelius' daughter is being sentenced to death. And her last words, she says, "Go free my soul, you've been trapped in an unworthy body." And as she bled out, she says, "Let them see that I am in fact the daughter of Marcus Aurelius." She was basically saying in her last moments that she wanted to make her father proud, that she wanted to go out as a courageous, unafraid, self-mastered Stoic. She wanted to demonstrate those virtues as Portia Cato had, as Cato had, as Seneca had, as Marcus Aurelius, who, unlike those other three, died of natural causes, did in their final moments. And after she said this, after she says, "Go free my soul, I will show that I am the daughter of Marcus Aurelius," she slit her veins and died. That to me is such a powerful model of Stoicism of any gender, but I wish it had been in the movie. So the badass of Gladiator II is Macrinus. That's Denzel Washington's character. And if you're a fan of Stoicism, it's really cool in the movie because as he sits down with Marcus Aurelius' daughter, he says, "Hey, I had the privilege of reading your father's meditations." And then he quotes a line from it. He says, "The best revenge is to be unlike he who performed the injury." And this is a real line. Marcus Aurelius did say something like that. I personally prefer the Gregory Hayes translation where he says, "The best revenge is to not be like that." I think in the Daily Stoic, we say the best revenge is to be unlike your enemy. What's so incredible about this line is that Marcus Aurelius does have to try to live it. In real life, he was betrayed by someone kind of like General Acacius. He's betrayed by Avidius Cassius, his most trusted general, who declares himself emperor. And in this moment, Marcus Aurelius could have exacted horrific Roman revenge. And instead he steadies his troops and he says, you know what, we're going to use this as an opportunity to show the Roman people how to deal even with civil wars. He says that there's a right way to deal even with betrayal and civil war. And so he strives to handle the situation with grace and understanding. And ultimately we're told he weeps when his enemy is murdered and Marcus Aurelius is deprived of the ability to grant him clemency. I guess in real life, Marcus Aurelius knew that adding extra injury on top of the injury, by allowing it to change you, by allowing it to make you worse, that was the part of it that you controlled. And in a sense, Macrinus is the ultimate example of this because he's the villain of the movie. He's awful. His anger, his loathing, his rage, his desire to right the injustices that have been done to him corrode his character, corrupt him, make him sadistic and awful and evil. The idea is that the pound of flesh will not make us feel better, and that only we can make ourselves feel better by moving on, by forgiving, by becoming better, not worse, for what we went through. My favorite story about Gladiator II is that on the first day of filming, Paul Mescal was sitting there and Ridley Scott comes up to him and he says, "Are you ready?" They're about to film like a $200 million movie, a sequel to a movie that had won multiple Oscars, had so much anticipation, so many people's favorite, including one of my favorite movies. And so Ridley asks him if he's nervous. And Paul says, like, yeah, I'm really nervous. And Ridley Scott looks at him and he says, "Your nerves are no fucking good to me." And that is such a classic Stoic idea, right? Is being nervous, is being worried, is being anxious, is being stressed out about this, is that going to make you better or worse here? You don't control the stakes, you don't control what you're about to go through, you don't control that, but you do control whether you settle yourself down, what you choose to focus on, what you decide to bring to the table. Stoicism is really a philosophy of nerve control. That's what Marcus Aurelius is doing in meditations, calming himself down, working through things, asking himself questions like, hey, are my nerves any good to me in this situation? Are they helpful or are they harmful? Really, the first two virtues of Stoicism, courage and discipline, are about precisely that. Putting yourself in scary situations a lot so they're not so scary. Reminding yourself that, hey, I gotta focus here. I don't have any spare energy to spend on worry, spend on looking backwards, extrapolating out on the future. I gotta do this thing in front of me. I have a little note card next to my desk right here from the choreographer Martha Graham. I wrote a quote from her I love. She says, "Never be afraid of material. The material knows when you are frightened, and it will not help." When I sit here and write, I know that being nervous, imposter syndrome, doubt, all that shit, it's not gonna help me do the thing. The thing is hard enough. I wanna bring my best self to that. And I wanna push fear, perfectionism, doubt, worry, all that shit aside and focus on what's in front of me. And that's what Ridley Scott was telling the star of his movie. Marcus Aurelius was a good man. He was idealistic. He believed in a better future. He lays that out in meditation. And what he says that he learned from the Stoics like Thrasea and Helvidius and Cato, was to conceive of a society of equal laws governed by equality of status and of speech, and of rulers who respect the liberties of their subjects above all else. Now that might be what he believed, but In real life, the Roman Empire comes nowhere close to this, and Marcus Aurelius's reign comes nowhere close to this. I think that's an important idea that they get at in Gladiator II, the sequel to Gladiator. There's this scene where Macrinus, that's Denzel Washington's character, confronts Marcus Aurelius's daughter, who rightfully worships his father, but he rips back his toga and he shows the mark of a slave. He shows like the physical scar that Marcus Aurelius's Rome, the difference between the idealism and the reality, he shows its manifestness on him. As Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius's real life philosophical hero, would have himself known all too well. He says to her, like, your dreams about what Rome could be, he's like, I don't give a shit about that. I know what it is. Stripped of the ideology, stripped of the pomp and the circumstance and the propaganda. He's like, I know what it is. He had been owned by Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius did own slaves. In that same passage, that same section of Meditations, he pats himself on the back for not ever having laid a hand on his female slaves. And I guess not raping your slaves is better than raping your slaves, but if he was getting anywhere close to that idea of caring about the rights of people and the liberty and equality of everyone, well, he wouldn't have had them in the fucking first place, right? There's something there, right? The Stoics didn't get far enough, just as Thomas Jefferson, who was influenced by the Stoics, didn't get far enough. And George Washington, who was influenced by the Stoics, didn't get far enough. And people will say the same thing about our society today. But we can't just go, that's how it is. We have to strive to be better. He had absolute power. Marcus Aurelius could have gotten a little bit closer. He could have bridged that gap a little bit more. And so can we. It's tempting and noble to dream of changing the world, of course. But the harder and more essential job is like, how do we treat the people around us? What do we do with the power that we have? Stoicism does not demand perfection, but it does act for practical, immediate human action. And Marcus Aurelius failed there. So many of the Stoics did, as we ourselves did. And I think that's a really important lesson in the movie. Okay, so one of my favorite lessons from Gladiator II actually isn't in the movie. It's from an interview with Denzel Washington and Paul Mescal after. Denzel Washington, who by the way crushes in the movie, should have won Best Supporting Actor, proved why he's widely considered one of the greatest actors of all time, but maybe didn't get the recognition or the respect he deserved on it. But he says in this clip, he says, my happiness doesn't come from the roles I play or the accolades that people give him. And Paul says, but was that always true? And Denzel Washington says, no, of course not. He's like, I'm telling you after 70 years of experience. I've said this before. I said on my first book, I was 10% happy with it. 90%, what do people say about it? How's it doing? And I'd like to say that flipped, or it's gotten closer to flipping, but it's work. That took real work. Marcus Aurelius talks in real life in Meditations about how we care about ourselves more than other people, but for some reason we care about other people's opinions more than our own. I think Denzel Washington knows he fucking crushed it in that role. And that's why he doesn't care about the awards or care about other people. He knows he brought his best self to it. That's what Stoicism is. Did you do your best? Did you do what was in your control? Did you act the hell out of the lines assigned to you? And this is actually another key Stoic lesson, more from Epictetus than Marcus Aurelius, but maybe the filmmakers knew this. Epictetus said that we are all actors in a play. That the playwright or the director is in charge. They wrote the lines. They're deciding how it goes. But what we control is whether we act the hell out of the lines we've been given. And I think Marcus Aurelius in real life acts the hell out of being emperor, even though that wasn't something he chose. And Epictetus, who experiences far more adversity and difficulty and far more powerlessness, still acts the hell out of the role that he had and ultimately influences Marcus Aurelius as a result. But basically Denzel says, like, 70 years of experience, don't listen to them. He says, listen in here. And then the other thing he says, which Marcus Aurelius certainly would have related to, he says, spend quiet time. He says 5 minutes to yourself every morning where you're thinking, you're reflecting. By the way, what do you think Marcus Aurelius' Meditations is? This is Marcus Aurelius in the morning. That's why he opens book 5 at dawn when you awake, right? He opens book 2 when you wake up in the morning. Tell yourself, right? Marcus Aurelius is having quiet time with himself, where he's thinking about who he wants to be, what's important, reminding himself of his values. Denzel Washington goes, 5 minutes of quiet. Very hard to do. Yeah, that place of ataraxia that the Stoics talk about, stillness, it's extremely difficult. But it's where insights come from. It's It's where happiness comes from. It's where peak and elite performance come from. It's where contentment comes from. It's where self-awareness and self-discovery comes from. He says, don't reach for it. He's talking about, don't reach for this thing. He says, reach for this thing. Reach for a journal. Spend some time, do your morning pages, do that reflecting, and then carry that stillness with you for the rest of the day. And then he concludes with a question. He says, I ask you all, what would you do with 5 minutes of silence? That's a beautiful question, and that's where I'll end this video. When I wrote The Daily Stoic 8 years ago, I had this crazy idea that I would just keep it going. The book was 366 meditations, but I'd write one more every single day and I'd give it away for free as an email. I thought maybe a few people would sign up. Couldn't have even comprehended a future in which 750,000 people would get this email every single day, and would for almost a decade. If you want to get the email, if you want to be part of a community that is the largest group of Stoics ever assembled in human history, I'd love for you to join us. You can sign up and get the email totally for free, no spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want at dailystoic.com/email.